If you agree, I will proceed as I normally do here, which is to collect some questions and then you reply to them all at once.
Can I have a chance to respond
course,
very
of course.
briefly?
Then
And
you
I
go-
will
then
not
you
take
go
time
first.
away in order to deepen the disagreement.
Feel free to do so.
Okay, of course, nobody argues open border or completely closed borders. This is a matter of degree. But I would argue if in 2015 in Germany, if there would not have been such an influx of refugees and asylum seekers and migrants, we would not have seen the birth of such a chauvinist, right-wing, populist party. So Max Weber again distinguished between, so to say, ethics of consciousness and ethics of responsibility. And you may be on the one side, on the consciousness side, having a clear ethic, and there are many arguments for it, but it may have consequences which completely run against your normative ethics. So I see cases where you have in Germany, in Sweden, and Austria in 2005, you had a non-controlled influx. Even in normative terms, I'm very much in favor of a multicultural society. But if a country or if a government, if a state argues we cannot do anything as the German government did, then the people ask, why should we have these elites in the government? Big, big mistake. And the second last point I want to mention here, Jan, you said about right-wing populists are moralizing politics. I agree. But at the same time, the Greens and parts of the Social Democratic Party, where I feel myself close to, are moralizing exactly with the same intensity. If you use the term in the academic spheres or in the what one can sometimes call hyper-liberal sphere, if you are saying this may have been a problem that the Merkel government did not close the borders after the first weeks, then you are immediately a chauvinist, a racist. You are excluded from the discourse. And this is what happened. The same with gender things. They may be completely wrong, but they are not allowed to talk. And this is water on the mills of the right-wing populists. And because both sides are moralizing that much, this cleavage will stay and will stay as a cultural one.
All right, very good. So who wants to ask questions, please? Here. Please identify yourself shortly and make a concise question.
Let me introduce myself. I am Alberto Amaral Jr., Professor of International Law at the Faculty of Law of the University of São Paulo. First, my question is directed to Professor Merkel. Which are the most likely things for European politics to the rise of populism in the near future? Second, my question is directed to Jan. And you emphasized the relevance of pluralism as being intrinsic to democracy. And the lack of pluralism has been a characteristic of populism. But some cases are easily identifiable when you state the absence of pluralism. For example, when you deny the legitimacy of a political opposition. But there are other situations, gray areas. For example, free speech in the United States and in the European Union. How to understand the real limits of free speech, to comprehend and to understand how broad should be a polity to realize pluralism. My question is, how much suppression of pluralism is necessary for populism to consummate?
Good. Anyone else wants to ask a question? Here, ladies first, then you go.
Thank you. My name is Marina Gibson. I'm a law student in the master's degrees program of the State University of São Paulo. And I have a question. It can be for both professors. How can an unstable and recent democracy like Brazil deal with the changes proposed by the right-wing populists that aims to withdraw the fundamental rights from minorities, which some of their proposals at the National Congress aims to reduce the rights of some population, like women and the LGBT people and all these cases, and why, from a normative view, there is a relevant reason to moralize politics by both sides.
Good. Ian, Angela, I think we're going to have 2 rounds of questions here. So,
A very simple question. Roberto Teixeira da Costa. I'm from the GACINT and the University of São Paulo. What is the worst for democracy? Populism of the right or populism of the left?
right. So since this is
I know which answer you want to hear.
well, since this is a short question, Ian, and then Angela, and then we close and we come back to the table.
I'm Jan Eichbaum, Consul General of Luxembourg. My question is, when the democracy, and I think I want to have an homage today of what happened in Christchurch in New Zealand, that 48 or 49 Muslims were killed in the mosque yesterday. When actually actions such as this and other far right or far left actions happen where actually people are hurt and people are killed, and this is actually, you know, when you go above and beyond the theory and to actions where you actually disregard minorities.
Angela.
I'm Angela Alonso, professor of University of São Paulo and president of SEBRAP. I have two questions for both of you. One, I'm using the microphone, but it's not working.
No, it's working, but speak louder.
Okay. So I'd like to ask you about the utility of using the concept of populism nowadays. It's an old concept. It has been used to talk about many different situations in many different times. So I'm wondering why to come back to this concept that's a losing one, and rather than create a new one or to discuss the case by case and then construct a new concept to talk about this new reality. So that's my first point. The second one is, can we talk about this, what we could define as right-wing politics, without talking about the left right-wing politics is not, those political debates are always relational. So ones are talking about or against the other side. So I'm wondering if you could say something about this relationship, because it seems to me that the right wing has been pushed to this moral debate because they do not have more the real socialism to talk against. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about those points. Thanks.
And finally, why do you think populism has come to stay? What are the factors behind it? Does it have anything to do with the capitalism in its new form, or not?
These are very interesting questions, and I'm certainly cannot answer all of them, and Jan will do at least as I can do a good job on answering it. The first one on the European Union. What can the European Union do against the illiberalization of certain member states? I'm extremely skeptical that the European Union can do very much, even if there are legal norms which would allow them to do it. In the moment where the European institutions try to intervene into the nation states in these matters, the member state, they will only increase the ressentiments against the European Union among broad, certainly not all, but broad sectors of the society. And if the European Union massively try to stop the Polish or the Hungarian government to colonize the judiciary and to discriminate against NGOs, the regime will use it and will argue these are illegitimate external interventions into the domestic matters. So I'm very, very skeptical about that. What is the difference between, or let me add the following. The European Union is extremely unpopular at the moment in many, many countries. And if they would, let's say, massively intervene in Hungary or Poland, they will get a reaction, let's say, from the Italian government. And they are very much afraid of a domino effect. If Great Britain leaves the European Union, others could do it as well. So the European Union is in a highly complicated situation at the moment, and therefore they are not the most potent actor. What is the difference? It comes out of different question. What is the difference between left-wing and right-wing populism? In theory, I think the difference is quite easy. Right-wing populism is exclusive on ethnic and cultural and religious terms. Left-wing populism, in theory, tries to bring in the marginalized sectors of the society. This is at least a claim. Those who were not represented, who are not the winner of the economic development, they claim to bring them in. So on theory, they are socioeconomically inclusive. In practice, and Jan mentioned this, in practice at least they have two things in common. The first one is they embark on a majoritarian idea of democracy. The winner takes it all. The winner And even if the winner is only one with 50.1, or in the Trump case of 49, not the real winner, but they claim to have the legitimacy to decide on that. And the second point is they are quite critical against intermediary organization of representative democracy. They are critical against political parties, they are very critical against parliaments, and then they tend to destroy if they have the power. And this is certainly one point we have seen in Venezuela, which I would consider no longer a real left-wing populist party. This has become a hardcore left authoritarian regime. I do not see so many populist claims now under Maduro. So I insist there is a difference between left and right-wing populism. Since I was flying in this morning, leaving yesterday Germany, I have not heard the latest news about New Zealand. This is certainly where Jan can say something. A last point, it goes to, I think your name was Marine, the law student. The minority protection. This is a kind, certainly, of a litmus test for the quality of democracy. But what is at stake in the United States as well is how strong institutions are. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant once argued, a good republic is one where the institutions are constructed in a way that they can even govern a people of devils. And then he adds, if they have reason. So why should then the institutions not hold against the devil in government? Why should the institution of the US political system not hold against Donald Trump? And I see some indicators that these institutions hold. However, in countries which do not have such a strong and long democratic tradition, and I would not only subsume at the end Germany, but certainly Brazil among these cases as well, these institutions may not so deeply rooted in society, and they may not be so able to keep somebody who is a governing devil, so to say, within the boundaries of democratic constitutions. So I still see a difference between the United States and Latin American democracies.
So all excellent, i.e. extremely difficult questions. Alberto, I'm not going to sit here now and give you in 5 seconds the uniquely, universally valid theory of free speech. What I'm going to say is that, first of all, maybe it's worth underlining that, yes, there's no such thing as a non-pluralist democracy. At the same time, pluralism is not a first-order political value like liberty, equality, maybe dignity. So this is a different point than people who say, oh, the more pluralism, always the better. You know, as much diversity as possible is always the best possible world. And against that background, I think it's maybe worth saying that there can be a reasonable pluralism about pluralism itself. In other words, different countries, against the background of different historical experiences, different political cultures, come to reasonably different views. So Germany bans parties. Greece doesn't ban party, even though nowadays it clearly has a kind of neo-Nazi party on the scene. Well, they drew different lessons from a history of dictatorship, and they are both reasonable things to say. They just lead to different outcomes. But I think we as theorists could not from on high say that, oh, one is normatively obviously wrong and the other one is obviously normatively right. And I think broadly speaking, that also applies to free speech. On the whole question of what to do, I'm reluctant to kind of, now hand out 3 bullet points about all you have to do is this and this and this. But 3 suggestions on the basis maybe of the experiences of other countries that have seen the rise of populist actors and then also populists in government. One thing that I think has been very important is how exactly the opposition presents its role. I think a typical mistake has been to end up in a situation where an opposition no longer makes clear the difference between, on the one side, normal policy disagreements. Okay, the government wants this, we're the opposition, we explain why we were against it. That's the normal stuff of democracy. As opposed to, on the other side, basically a situation where we're no longer talking about the content and the outcome of the game, but changes in the rules of the game itself. In the US, it's become very typical that defenders of Trump say, look, whatever he does, the Democrats never like it. So I stop listening to really what they say because they're always complaining, etc., which is an indication that maybe they haven't always done a good deal in terms of marking the difference between normal policy disagreement, where not everything is the end of democracy. So the end of the Affordable Care Act, one can regret, one can be for. That's not a question that touches on deep issues of democracy. Voter suppression, that goes to the heart of how democracy is supposed to work. So I think it's an art of making that distinction as clear as possible. Secondly, this is obviously a very facile thing to say, but given that these right-wing populists, I think always in one form or another engage in culture war. In a sense, that's their political business model. That's what they want to do. They want to rile people up. They want to say, here are the real people with their symbolic markers. Here are those who don't really belong. As I tried to hint at in the talk, I think for many people that's actually not really part of their lived experience, which is another way of saying the media are extremely important. And I don't want to lecture you on the importance of WhatsApp and how, in a sense, it's become possible to bypass traditional journalists entirely. But I think that's one of the things that I think we all have to think much more about. That in a sense, we can't just sort of jump to a simple policy fix or, here's a great PR strategy for the opposition. This kind of institutional infrastructure has to be thought. And I agree with Wolfgang that in a sense it's a typical move by populists that they weaken intermediary organizations, the media, but also parties, which supposedly have intra-party democracy. Both traditional media and inter-party democracy means that a certain degree of pluralism is going to be injected into the process. That no longer happens if you have a tweeter-in-chief who can basically connect directly with the people. And what you also don't have anymore is the role of intermediary institutions in simply slowing things down and giving you more time to consider different opinions. So that's kind of a more structural thing I would consider. Lastly, and this also goes to your question about what's going to happen, is this here to stay? I don't make predictions, especially not about the future, but I think it's important to get one thing about recent history right, which then also might be an important indication about the future and also in terms of strategy. Contrary to this very popular image of the populist wave, the allegedly unstoppable trend of our time, or as Nigel Farage, for whom the image of the wave was apparently of insignificant world historical meaning, the tsunami, as he put it, of populism, we have to, I think, remember that for the most part, this is still not really an autonomous force that, all of a sudden gains power everywhere. Farage didn't bring about Brexit. It was the Conservative Party who basically told people in the UK that Brexit is a jolly good idea. It wasn't a spontaneous grassroots movement of, as the cliche has it, angry white workers who carried Trump to the presidency. It was a very established party that nominated him and supported him until the very last day and still largely supports him today. So if we don't see that conservative enablers have been absolutely crucial, at least on the right side of the story, we're much more likely to be defeatist and say, oh, people just went crazy and now bring these demagogues to power and there's nothing we can do. Whereas many of us, I assume, have enough of a link to these much more established conservative actors to basically, to put it very bluntly, if I may, to tell them, look, I understand why, from your point of view, Trump's tax cut is great news. But think of this other stuff. I can see why, from your point of view, Orban is great news for the German car industry. But think of this other stuff. And I won't spell out what this might mean in a context here. Briefly on to, should we be using this concept of populism at all? Very clear-cut answer. Yes and no. So, of course, you're completely right that this comes with a lot of baggage. There are lots of different important ways of understanding that word against the background of very different historical experiences. So obviously, in the US, populism means something very different, broadly speaking, than in Europe. And you, in a sense, you get into hot water immediately if you say things that clash with certain historical understandings. Plus, very obviously, this is a politically contested concept. It's one that, you know, has been instrumentalized for political purposes. All of this is true. At the same time, this is true for virtually all of our political concepts. So anybody can always instrumentalize something. Everything has a history. So if we basically had to say, okay, every single time we want to talk about democracy or liberty or equality, we have to start from scratch, and here's my new word, that with my enormous power as a professor I will now impose on the world, I don't think we get very, very far. So I think I agree that it can be, in a sense, problematic if you have like a 140-character version of what you're trying to say, but if you maybe have enough time to explicate the thought behind it and sort of construct an ideal type, and then people say, but look, you know, maybe we should call it something different, that's fine. I mean, I'm not insisting on the word. If you say, look, you know, this should much better be described as one-party authoritarianism with a popular justification, okay, I'm not invested in the particular ism as a word. And maybe lastly, and this sort of loops back into to the other question, in terms of sort of the role of the left. There's plenty one can criticize about the left. Don't get me wrong, but I think again there's maybe a tendency today to too quickly say, well, it's sort of all this is now partly our own fault because, you know, especially but not only in the US, we pushed identity politics too far, you know, and that provoked this backlash. And, you know, we don't really have any other solutions. We have no idea what to do about policy. But one thing we can really do ourselves, which is no longer to push for transgender toilets and all this sort of stuff. And with all due respect, I think that's profoundly wrong. It's empirically wrong. If you look at, you know, people who've done a lot of work on what really mattered in the 2016 elections, one thing is clear: transgender toilets did not matter one bit. I mean, the idea that all these guys in the South or whatever your cliched idea of you know, left behind places might be said, oh, you know, Clinton is great, but this toilet thing, you know, no, come on, this was not decisive in any shape or form. And more importantly, and this goes back to the question of minorities. I think it's important to remember that a lot of the movements that now are easily subsumed under identity politics can as easily be understood as movements for the protection of basic rights. I mean, Black Lives Matter is not really an identity construction project. It's people saying, I don't want to be shot. Me Too is not some great identity project. It's basically people saying, I don't want to be harassed and raped. So you can translate, you know, what supposedly is all about highly particular identities which outsiders can never understand into a kind of rights language where then the other side might still push back, but I think the way they have to justify their pushback changes significantly in terms of how they have to formulate their strategies.
But if we cannot talk about or cannot explain the emergence of right-wing populism as a reaction to something, maybe as a reaction to left-wing, I would not call it a reaction against left-wing, but I do see this is a reaction against at least two things. The one is, as you have said, Jan, technocracy, expertocracy on the one side, and let's call it hyper-liberalism. And this is something you feel in the discourses. The people do not, or a large sector of the people who feel not represented are reacting extremely negatively. And it is not occasionally that right-wing populists are mobilizing on these super liberal elites. And there is a reaction. Otherwise, we cannot really explain why, after 3 decades of neoliberal and hyper-liberal exportocracy, you find the reaction across almost all countries in the West. We have to explain it. And it's not a question who is guilty, but it's a question of actio and reactio. This is what I meant.
Well, let me close. Thank you so much for such an intellectually provoking and passionate given lecture. 2 things are clear. Well, the topic is not simple, and populism is not a sort of a crazy outburst of emotions that will consume itself. So there will be lots of things to talk about in the coming future. And I would like to reiterate to Michael that they have a permanent invitation to come back. So thank you so much. Thank you all for listening.